Good evening, everyone. Welcome to ADA's book discussion. I appreciate all of you joining us. Look forward to this evening, our second book discussion. This evening, we are discussing ADA founder John Kenneth Galbraith, and the book is John Kenneth Galbraith, His Life, His Politics, His Economics. We are joined by the author of that book, Dr. Richard Parker, economist, lecturer at public policy at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And we are delighted to also have with us Dr. James K. Galbraith, the University of Texas at Austin, where he holds the Lloyd M. Vincent Chair, Junior Chair in Government Business Relations at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I'm going to turn it over now to Jamie to get us started. Thank you, Dr. Galbraith.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Don. And I have to say, it's that your minor slip on the misstatement on the question of Richard's surname was entirely fitting in the nature of a Freudian slip, if there ever was one. I'm going to be very brief here. It's a great pleasure to be here. Hold on, technically I'm getting feedback in my ear. Okay, I think that's gone. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be part of this event, and to bring a measure of support and celebration to Americans for Democratic Action, an organization which was part of our lives from the beginning of mine, and a great commitment of my father's at a crucial moment in the organization's history and in his personal life. Richard Parker, a great friend. I'll just say three things about Richard. First of all, four things. First is that we've known each other for more decades than either of us can care to count. But that at Harvard, where he is wrapping up a career as a teacher and scholar, he is beloved by his students, and he represents at the Kennedy School he's one of the last pillars of a true ADA style Kennedy liberalism, which is greatly to his credit in an environment which is somewhat different now from what it was once. With respect to the ADA, and he's well known to you all as a past president of this organization and someone who led it very capably through his term of office. And for us, for my brothers and myself, he's really just another one of us. He's a brother, and someone who became part of our family as in the late years of my father's life, and as he did the research and the writing on this really remarkable book, John Kenneth Galbraith, His Life, His Politics, His Economics, is right here. I will say of this book two things that my father said. The first was when he read the galleys, he reflected on it, he said, this is so good, I think I wrote it myself. And the second was a conversation that Richard had with him on the very last day of his life in the hospital. I had been there for a number of days. Dad was clearly failing. Richard came in with a copy of the Japanese translation, which had just appeared, and Dad took it, looked at it, turned a page or two, put it down, fixed Richard with a gaze and said, Richard, in a very soft voice at that point, as he was suffering from pneumonia, could hardly speak, he said, I do not read Japanese, but given the importance of the subject matter, I shall devote the time I have remaining to mastering it. It gives you a sense of the affection that all of us feel for Richard Parker, and the admiration that we have for the really great work he did in providing what I think will be enduringly the definitive biography of my father, John Kenneth Galbraith. So on that, let me turn the floor with great thanks to Richard Parker. Richard, it's all yours.
Jamie, thank you very, very much. What a wonderful introduction. And Don, thank you for inviting me. And I see Amy on board as well too. And so Amy, I'm delighted to see you as well. It's a pleasure as a former president of ADA to be back with you. And it's a pleasure to talk about Ken Galbraith, because Ken was one of the founders of ADA and himself served as president of the organization in crucial years in the mid-1960s, when many of the challenges of American post-war liberalism came to a head and tragically meant for a long period of time an eclipse of American liberalism and the rise of an American conservatism from which we're still suffering the aftershocks and after effects. What I want to talk about tonight are two periods. The first is the late 1940s, when ADA was formed and Ken's participation in it. I then want to talk about the mid-1960s, when Ken, as president of ADA, took an active role in trying to recruit candidates to run against Lyndon Johnson because of Lyndon Johnson's role in Vietnam. I should emphasize that Ken was an enormous admirer of Lyndon Johnson's domestic program, and I am as well. And I am quite pleased that the two faculty members leading this discussion today are from the LBJ and the JFK schools, which shows you the wide and dramatic range of thought represented here by the two of us. It's also a delight because at the end of this conversation, I want to join with Jamie to talk a little bit about the future of American liberalism today. And I think it's the springboard for a discussion that we all need to be part of, because these are challenging times of the first order, and where all of this is going is as important as it was in 1947 or in 1967, the two periods I'm going to talk about. The Americans for Democratic Action was formed in January of 1947. By coincidence, it is 2 months after I was born, and 2 months after both John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon had first been elected to public office. At the same time, an obscure figure in Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, who had been a judge, had also been elected, but more about him in a while. American liberalism was in crisis in 1947. The day I was born, November 5th, 1946, the Democrats had lost control of both houses of Congress, and key progressives, key Rooseveltian liberals in both houses had been dramatically defeated. Richard Nixon's election in Southern California was one example of that. McCarthy's election in Wisconsin was another. And what was happening was that the initial Roosevelt era was coming to an end with Roosevelt's death, and the question of succession was up for grabs. Harry Truman had been installed as the vice presidential candidate only under some duress exercised on President Roosevelt, because many in the party machinery and in the financial sections that backed the party were deeply alarmed at the prospect that Wallace could become president. And for good reason in some ways, although not perhaps as good a reason as would cause them to shift to Harry Truman as the nominee. The issue in January of 1947, thus, was to be an evaluation of what had just happened in those November 1946 elections, what it meant for the liberal and progressive wings of the Democratic Party, and what Rooseveltian liberalism was going to be now that there was no longer a Roosevelt to lead it. There was an organization called the Union for Democratic Action that had been formed in that window between the beginning of the Second World War and American entry into the Second World War. Then it was distinctive in two ways. It was a progressive organization that was vehemently anti-isolationist. What we oftentimes forget is that progressivism in the 1930s was in large measure organized around a deep sense of the priority of isolating America from the travails of Europe. This was a period in American political life where it seemed that the issues in front of Americans took absolute priority, and that the exercise of American power abroad, which had been weakly attempted by President Wilson had failed, and that to try to repeat it would only jeopardize the domestic project. So the Union for Democratic Action had formed on the one hand in opposition to the isolationism of so many progressive and liberal groups of the 1930s. But it had a second pillar. The second pillar was anti-communism. It had seen enough of Stalin. It had seen enough of the American Communist Party to believe that there was no future for American liberalism in close conjunction with the party or the party's members. And so UDA comes into existence, gathers a good deal of support from labor union leaders and civic figures and political figures within the Democratic Party. But as I have just noted, it runs up against the wall of the election of 1946. And James Loeb, who was the executive director of UDA, decided that it was time to disband UDA and aim for what he thought of as a broad, mass-based organization that would be called, by agreement, Americans for Democratic Action. At the heart of it, besides Loeb, was the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr had been central to the creation of the UDA, and he would be central in many ways to the creation of ADA and emblemized the spirit of ADA in a sense, in being himself vigorously anti-isolationist, then also vigorously anti-Soviet, anti-Stalinist communist as well, too. But he was trying, as ADA would itself try to do, find a role for an American liberalism that was more than simply opposed to other things. The question was, what would American liberalism be for? And it launches post-Rooseveltian American liberalism into a period of great ferment as it tries to take on a new identity as, in effect, inheritors of the Roosevelt tradition, but without FDR playing a leadership role. They are able, however, to persuade Eleanor Roosevelt to play a more than symbolic role in the early days of ADA. And it is that informal blessing, if you will, by Mrs. Roosevelt that I think gave a tenor to the organization, launched it in a direction that really picked up on a lot of the values that she, more than her husband, had championed. A concern about human rights, a desire to make sure that we not go down the road of a militarized Cold War, if at all possible. The belief that racial equality and, in fact, also gender and religious tolerance and equality were to become the new norms. Much of the fight that many of you know went on at the Democratic Convention in 1948 is in no small part a consequence of that kind of liberalism's assertion of its presence in a Democratic Party that increasingly, as the years passed after Roosevelt's death, was being dominated in all too many ways by the Southern wing of the Democratic Party. Now, Ken Galbraith's role in this was in no small part important. And it was important for him too, because he was at a place in his own life and career where big change was about to happen to him as well. He had grown up in Canada, had gone to Ontario Agriculture College, won a scholarship to the University of California at Berkeley, where he completed his PhD, and then had found his first real teaching job at Harvard, not as a macroeconomist, but as an agricultural economist, working with Professor Black, who was at that point one of the eminent agricultural economists in America. The idea that Harvard was focused on agricultural economics today, I think, would jar many people, including many economists at Harvard. And yet what one wants to understand is that a quarter of the American population was still engaged in agriculture as a productive pursuit. And the question of how the country would be fed was of no small consequence in a period when agricultural prices had fallen rather more dramatically than industrial prices in the early stages of the Depression. And so Ken's work that had included a summer stop working in the Roosevelt administration between the time he graduated Berkeley and started at Harvard, that had laid the ground for Ken's conviction that it was only through the cooperation of markets and government, the close coordination of the activity.
Don, you need to unmute Richard.
I was muted there for a second. I just unmuted myself. Okay. I don't know where I was lost, but the point was that Ken is going to make an important step in his economics and academic career by arriving at Harvard, but he arrives in a way that one might not think of him, which is as a budding young agricultural economist. What I'm trying to emphasize here, though, is that his familiarity and his academic work in the 1930s, in the mid 1930s, on agricultural economics is part of the foundational point of view that he's going to bring to this larger world of macroeconomics that will be in some sense inaugurated by the publication of Keynes's general theory in 1936. Ken has the good luck to win a fellowship that will take him to Cambridge, where he hopes to study under Keynes himself, but does not because Keynes suffers serious health setbacks that year. What it does do, however, is introduce Ken to key actors in the emerging Keynesian world and allows Ken to return to Harvard for several years in the late 1930s, fully able to engage as a young Keynesian apostle among those needing to be converted among Harvard economists. But what's important here is that he then leaves Harvard, not of his own will, but because Harvard decides to dismiss several young economists as part of an attempt to cleanse the department politically of a few left-wingers that were considered far too dangerous for the time. Ken ultimately ends up at the Office of Price Administration in Washington, where he and Leon Henderson are given the complex responsibility of managing price controls and wage controls during the Second World War. He does this quite well, quite boldly, and it reconnects him with the possibility of government's ability to interact with markets in ways that produce a better functioning economy. But he also then decides in the middle of the war that this is not for him, and he accepts a job from, of all people, Henry Luce, to become, in effect, the economics editor of Fortune magazine. Now, Henry Luce, years later, would tell John F. Kennedy that he, Luce, was the man who had taught Ken Galbraith how to write, and that he'd regretted it ever since. I think Ken actually had the ability to write before he was taken under Luce's wing, but I have no doubt that the experience of working as a journalist helped him sharpen his command, both of prose and also of his ability to construct powerful narrative. Two features of Galbraithian writing that are signatures of Galbraithian thought. The reason I've given you this background is that I want you to understand that he comes from a very particular kind of history and experience that is both significant in and of itself and also important to understand at the genesis of Americans for Democratic Action. Because what you'll see in Ken's activity in ADA in those early years is quite distinctive. There were members of ADA who became preoccupied themselves with a kind of virulent anti-communism that divided many in the liberal community, and in some sense limited ADA's own influence among the broader liberal community. Ken was never part of that group. Ken focused on economic issues. Ken focused on a continuation of essential Rooseveltian values in the Truman era and created for himself a reputation not only as a thoughtful and scholarly thinker about economic issues, but as a shrewd judge of the direction of politics, as many in the Americans for Democratic Action by the 1950s, with the rise of McCarthy, realized that the virulence of their own anti-communism had gone too far. Now, Ken will play a role as well in the run-up to the 1952 election when Adlai Stevenson is nominated. And I could go into that, but I'm going to skip over it because I want to skip forward to the 1960s, because this is another and central period in the life of American liberalism, as well as ADA, as well as Ken Galbraith. Ken is elected president of ADA in 1967. The war is raging. Civil rights has not yet led to the death of Martin Luther King, but already the violence that will mark the civil rights struggle, the reactionary violence that had for a time been confined to the South, is now spreading across the nation as a whole. And what Ken's great service to ADA is in this period is to hold it to high principles. ADA had always, as a functioning Washington organization, lived in a complex universe of both principle and retail politics. And there was a wing of ADA that, while unhappy with Johnson about the war, felt that it could not speak up against Johnson and the war without betraying Johnson and the Democratic Party. And of course, this was a view that Johnson himself encouraged. He was not inviting criticism from the ADA in 1967 or from anyone else in that period of time. What's so important is that Ken decided that principle was the first and most compelling obligation, not only of him as president of ADA, but of ADA as a leading organization for American liberalism. It led to real fissures within the organization. George Meany withdrew substantial AFL-CIO funding from the organization. There were a number of donors who also stopped giving. These kinds of decisions are never costless. But ultimately, I think we can look back on the 1960s and recognize just how right Ken was to step up both personally and to lead the ADA into adoption of a position of opposition to the war. Now, a year later, after Ken has personally been deeply involved in first attempting to recruit Bobby Kennedy, and then when Bobby says that he won't run, in recruiting Eugene McCarthy to run, there is a moment at the Democratic Convention where here again, Ken is going to be called upon to make an important decision about principle in politics that I think is worth our investigating or reflecting on. Because all the way through the months leading up to the Democratic Convention, Ken had remained a stalwart supporter of Eugene McCarthy. This had led to tensions between him and the Kennedy family when Bobby had decided and reversed himself and decided to enter in the race, seeing how well McCarthy was doing against Johnson, a success that Bobby and his advisors had not thought was possible. But that loyalty to McCarthy, a feature of Ken's politics that I deeply admire, was also a loyalty to the value of the Democratic Party and the ultimate nominee of the Democratic Party in 1968, Hubert Humphrey, who incidentally was another original founder of ADA in 1947. There were lots of reasons by the end of that Democratic Convention, given the violence that had taken place, given the process by which Humphrey had won the nomination, given the fissures within the Democratic Party, given the principle, the position that Ken had adopted in opposition to Johnson's war, and his realization, quite frankly, that Humphrey was not going to be able to step very far away from Johnson on this issue as the Democratic nominee. Ken, nonetheless, after the convention, took the important decision to return to the party and support and actively support Hubert Humphrey's race for the president, realizing that the danger of Richard Nixon's election was far greater than the heresy that Hubert Humphrey had committed in the eyes of so many liberals. And here, once again, I find Ken making that careful, calculated decision that balances principle and the importance of making political decisions in a real context, in a real world, in real time. And I think ultimately, once again, looking back historically, it's very hard to say that he was mistaken in shifting support to Hubert Humphrey in order to attempt to block the election of Richard Nixon. Now, let me now skip forward to the present, because what I want to do is re-engage JK Galbraith in a conversation about where American liberalism has to go today and where ADA might think that it should go today as well too. Jamie is as a thoughtful a writer and speaker on issues of the intersection of politics and economics that I know, and I think that rather than having me continue this monologue, a dialogue between the two of us, joining then a conversation with the rest of you, might make this the most fruitful use of the time we have left. So, Jamie, would you say a few words about where you think American liberalism and ADA should be heading right now?
I think the most important thing American liberalism is, thank you for everything you just said, Richard. The most important thing right now is to stop the drift toward a new Cold War and the dangerous steps that may, in fact, turn a Cold War into a hot one at any given moment. We are embarked on a policy of unnecessarily dangerous, reckless confrontation in Europe and in Asia. And this is against countries with which we do not have any particular ideological conflict, as much as people might like to believe that there is one. The material and conditions are entirely different from what they were, and the ideological conditions entirely different from what they were in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. And this is something where we are committing enormous amounts of resources to the maintenance of a military establishment whose effectiveness was just recently demonstrated in Afghanistan beyond any possibility of doubt. This is going to prevent the country from addressing the real problems that we face. And until we link these two issues, as we have not done, the American liberalism isn't going to make traction on climate, on inequality, on precarity, on the domestic concerns that need to be addressed. That would be my first, and maybe if we go on, I may come back and repeat it at that point.
Well, let me echo some of what Jamie has just said, and again, try to point out why it was that I chose that 1940s period and the 1960s period in order to underscore what Galbraith's son has now just absolutely underscored a third time. What Ken saw in the 1940s, he saw again in the 1960s. And I think Jamie and I both see in the current period that there is a temptation to go to arms, if not to war, as a political solution, as an economic solution, as a diplomatic solution that will only lead to new problems. What you have to understand is that American liberalism, to a great degree, was tethered to what amounted to a military Keynesianism in the first 20 years after the Second World War. We got a larger federal government out of the post-Second World War period. We got a government that demonstrated competence in a number of ways, but we did it by spending over half of the federal budget between 1947 and the end of the Vietnam War on the Defense Department. And more broadly, I should say, also on the national intelligence agencies as well, too. And when one takes into account the additional costs of weapons development in the Department of Energy, the increasing cost of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the amount of interest that is defense's share of the total debt that the United States has incurred, you're looking at a military budget substantially larger than the Defense Department's budget. Standard accounting would say that the DoD's budget is about $700 billion. A better accounting of the American military budget would push it over $1 trillion a year. And we are in need of many things other than spending $1 trillion a year on the military. The other thing that I'd emphasize here, which is not in the 1947 or 1967 period, is the rise of finance. And I think Jamie has also written and spoken quite eloquently on that topic as well, too. And if there is a motif that I think American liberalism needs now to focus on, it is the rise of the financialization of the American and the global economy and the ways in which it is dramatically altering the economic choices that are made available to the American people and to the world. This is something that Ken became increasingly aware of from the 1970s on and wrote quite eloquently about from the 1970s forward, as in fact, financialization becomes an increasing feature of the American economic and political scene. Until we are willing to engage as liberals in both the dangers of militarism and the dangers of excessive financialization of the economy, we will be on a back foot politically in so many ways that I don't know how we intend to regain a solid progressive looking or progressive turning liberalism for the 21st century.
I'll put some concrete detail into the comment I just made. The Secretary of Defense, Mr. Austin, just was in Ukraine and then basically invited the Ukrainians to apply to join NATO. NATO forces move into Ukraine. You are basically inviting a conflict over the Donbass territory, which is part of Ukraine, but that Ukrainians do not control and are not going to control. This is not something that we should get into. It is not. It is exceedingly dangerous for the peace of Europe and the world. I don't know whether she's deputy or undersecretary of state. Ms. Nuland was just in Moscow telling the Russians they had to cut their diplomatic force in the United States by more than the number of diplomats they actually have. And the Russians said, okay, you want us to shut down all diplomatic interchange between our two countries? Go ahead, but it's your choice, not ours. We have been obviously making provocative gestures intended to encourage the government of Taiwan to declare independence from China, which would disrupt what is practically very stable status quo and put the Chinese government in an exceedingly difficult position internally for no conceivable gain except just to say the fantasy that this is going to somehow destabilize the largest country and one of the most successful economies in the face of the globe. It's going to happen. So I'm saying that we're looking here at concrete actions which have the almost universal support of the major press in this country and of the foreign policy establishment, which liberals need to start speaking up against because they are leading us down a path that we will deeply regret having taken.
Let me add a word about financialization and the COVID pandemic. It's important to realize that given all of the economic dislocation that has been imposed on the American economy and the world's economy, that the striking figure for me in the last 6 weeks is to read in Forbes magazine that the Forbes 400 increased their net worth by 40% to $4.7 trillion during these pandemic months. At the same time, 45% of American families tell the Federal Reserve that they don't even have $400 of available cash to address financial crises that might arise as a consequence of the pandemic. In other words, we need to rethink the foci of liberalism and put it squarely both in a tradition that Ken so nobly represented and that Jamie continues in the family tradition to represent, but that also would make ADA's voice ever more powerful and ever more relevant to the issues ahead of us. I think Joe Biden is doing a remarkable job, all things considered. can only say that I hope that the voter turnout next November and 2 years after that will match my own commitment to turning out as many of my relations and acquaintances as I possibly can. But we are at one of those pivotal moments in American and world history, at least as important as the Second World War or the Civil War in terms of our own national direction. And this is a time when liberals must both recognize the scale of that challenge and the scale of the potential opportunity, if only we're willing to do the intellectual work to prepare us for leadership.
There was a question about how liberalism has changed over the years, which I would answer by going back to your comments, Richard, about the 1960s, which was a very difficult time for liberals because it forced ADA, with my father's leadership, to take a stand against a president who embodied and carried out in many ways the most effective liberal program certainly in the history since Roosevelt, and in many ways completed and advanced the Rooseveltian agenda. And at the end of the day, I'm not as confident as you are that the steps taken at the time in which I was a very young participant were the correct steps. Given all of the consequences that unfolded through 1968 and beyond. But that was a decision that was taken, and it was a tough decision, and it was one which was, I think, forced on liberals by what they knew was the disaster unfolding in Vietnam. I would urge liberals to have the same attitude toward our leadership now, which is you have to recognize that the chance of getting something worse is there. But if liberals don't take a position and argue for it, then their leadership are going to be crowded from the right in a way which is going to just push the entire policymaking process to the point where liberal choices will not be made. And that's happening. I've already spoken about the foreign policy front, where it's clearly happening. It's also happening on the domestic front. And what we do have, I think, which is very encouraging, is that the Progressive Caucus in the House has stood its ground and said, no, we are not going to. It gets to the second question that was in the chat about the infrastructure bills, and the Progressive Caucus saying, no, we're not going to vote on the support the infrastructure bill until we get a larger social program that we can support, because we know if we pass the infrastructure bill, we're not going to get the social program. This was a correct strategic, tactical decision, and it's one which needs to be held to if the Progressive Caucus is going to have credibility going forward, and if the Democratic Party is going to have credibility going forward. Caving at this stage on these issues, and people will again conclude that if you can't have, if the Democratic Party is going to not be a real alternative to the Republican Party, then why not have the real thing? A problem that was very much Humphrey's problem in '68.
Let me add a story here. Jamie knows it. It's about his father, also late in his father's life. It was after Bill Clinton had left the presidency and George W. was in the White House. Clinton, for some time, had tried to persuade Galbraith to co-author a book with him about the future of American democracy, and Galbraith declined the opportunity. But Clinton kept courting him and came to Boston for a fundraiser, and in advance let Professor Galbraith know that he would very much like to meet Ken, and Ken explained that because of his age and his health condition, that would mean that Clinton would have to come to their home on Francis Avenue. Clinton was very accommodating, said that he would be over by 8 o'clock when the fundraiser was over. He doesn't show up until 10:30 because it's Bill Clinton, and Ken by that point was in his 90s. What I always remember about the conversation was that Ken was sitting in the upstairs bedroom. He'd gotten out one of his best suits and ties and was sitting there and had been waiting for the president since 8 o'clock. and then plunged into a very, very dynamic conversation with Bill Clinton that by 11 o'clock had left Bill Clinton looking a little exhausted. And as Clinton tried to make his way from the bedroom, Ken reached this enormous hand over to the forearm of President Clinton and said, and these were his words, "Mr. President, I want to say just one more thing. What this country doesn't need is two Republican parties." And Bill Clinton scampered out.
Good story, Richard. I'm going to grab a couple of other questions from the chat. I appreciate, Jamie, you grabbing some yourself. There's one here about, what
There's a question about economists and why there aren't more good ones. And the answer is that since the early 1970s, the profession has gone off into a hermetically sealed reactionary bubble that reflects the basic conceptual and material conditions of the middle of the 18th century. And so there are very few economists. The generation that my father was part of was a generation that had the experience, had actually created the economic system in the New Deal and had managed the economic system in the Second World War, and some of the younger cohorts that had been involved in among other things, trying to keep the nuclear forces under control. They were doing serious business, and they brought that to the academy, and that was the economics department at Harvard. Certainly, when I was very young. But that's not the case now. What we have now are people who are trained as academics, have a particular academic orientation. They cut their spurs by whatever the expression is, cut their teeth by publishing in journals that test you for conformism. So they have really nothing of interest to say. There are a handful who grow out of that at a certain stage in their careers, but it's only a handful, and it's not a handful that's likely to be reproduced by economics departments. So this is the task for universities to somehow figure out how to have an academic institution which is relevant to the policy challenges that we face, while overcoming the dominance of economics departments that are not. Richard and I are both in policy schools. I know about you, Richard, but I didn't have a lot of problems with having to turn down job offers from economics departments.
Jamie, once I realized that the economics profession had set a quota of 2 for the number of handsome, bearded, progressive economists, I realized that we were just not going to find enough room in the profession for more than a few of us. So until we could break that quota system, we're just not going to make progress.
There's one more question in the chat here, and I encourage folks to continue to ask questions. But one more here that I don't think we've touched on is, I guess, and I'll address this to either one of you. But what were Ken's views on organized labor, and then I guess bringing it forward to today, how would Ken feel about the decline, I guess, in the power of organized labor?
He had set out quite clearly in American capitalism the importance of organized labor as a balancing force along with big government and big business as a way to hold big business's power in check. And while he certainly had specific disagreements, as he did with George Meany about ADA's position on Vietnam, there was never a sense that Ken thought anything but positively about the presence of unions, and in fact, the largest possible enrollment of American workers in unionized institutions.
I may be wrong about this, but my impression is that the AFL-CIO today has approximately the same membership that it had in the 1950s. The difference is that at that time, it was 30% of the labor force and heavily concentrated in manufacturing. Now manufacturing is less than 10, is about 8% of the labor force. And the unions are organized in things like teaching and public service. But what that tells you is that the material conditions for labor organization have changed. And now the economy, from an employment standpoint, the labor standpoint, is dominated by what we can call stagnant services, jobs that are unstable, that are precarious, that are relatively low paid, and where the pay rates depend upon social norms that are set by the state, by the minimum wage, and by labor standards. And that's where one needs to put, in the first instance, one's emphasis. But one of the things we're learning is that there is leverage, and there's leverage for workers, which they're exercising now as a result of the fact that they got some money last year. And they're in a position where they can say no to bad working conditions and low pay. And guess what? They're doing so by the millions with clear-cut consequences, which are in the news. Of course, people say, oh, it's inflation, or it's this, or it's that. But no, it's that if you give people a little bit of security, guess what? They're going to express their view about the conditions under which they're living. And that's a lesson for liberals. First of all, you have to provide the security, and secondly, you have to listen to how people use it when they have it, because they are doing so right now.
And it has been enormously costly to lose that part of the American voting community and American labor force, and cede much of it to the Republican Party.
Well, if the people are reacted in voting for Donald Trump to the decline of the Upper Midwest as a manufacturing area, that's clear. That's why he won the three critical states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. That's why he won the election. That's, I think, is utterly. I can't imagine anything clearer than that. But they at the same time. The service workers and all across the region of the country that I live in, they're not hanging with the Republicans. They're moving to the Democrats. Harris County, Texas, the largest county in Texas, one of the largest counties in the country, doesn't have a single Republican office holder anymore. And you can see this this drift in other parts of the state. It certainly happened in Georgia, where my student Stacey Abrams had a distinct effect on the outcome of the presidential election and the outcome of the two Senate races in Georgia that year. So these transitions are in fact happening, and they're happening in spite of the fact that these are not centered on the manufacturing sector, where the trade unions were once the dominant force in the Democratic Party.
One more here. I'm going to read it. Could you please comment on your raising the alarm over U.S. provocations internationally versus the existential threat of climate change?
I'm sorry, let's see.
Who is it that is?
Well, yes, I think just address that comment directly. A major reason why I'm raising the alarm over these provocations is that they're getting in the way of the cooperation that's absolutely essential to deal with climate change. You simply cannot, and the Chinese are making this very clear. And the Chinese have diplomats, and they know how to send a message, and they're making this very clear that if we're intent upon raising issues that they consider to be internal to China, because in fact, let's face it, they are internal to China, and making that the foundation of their relationship, of the non-relationship between the two countries, we're not going to get cooperation from them on climate change. The Chinese have their own reasons to be concerned about climate change. It doesn't mean they're going to be inactive. But if we want to have a concerted effort, we have to be serious about it and not make it something that can be sidetracked by issues which are considered by the other side to be unnecessary provocations, in which fact I agree with them. Actually, they are by and large unnecessary provocations.
Richard, were you?
No, I was just going to add, I mean, I think that part of the problem that Europe is facing today is that the pressure being exerted by the Americans and also by East European governments in Hungary and Poland to essentially bear bait the Russians is going to be a major factor in the inability of the Europeans to themselves also participate in addressing these global climate issues. So it's China, but it's also Europe as well too.
Another question about the relationship between President Kennedy and Galbraith.
It was quite intimate and affectionate and long-lasting, and my students always love it when I remind them, when I tell them of Ken's note to President Kennedy saying that trying to communicate to the president through the State Department was like trying to fornicate through a mattress. I think there's always something to be learned from vivid expression. I think the more serious thing is that Ken and President Kennedy saw a way to not create a war in Vietnam. And we're moving in that direction by 1963, in no small part because of Ken's direct efforts as ambassador to India, because India happened to sit on the control commission that governed the peace agreement that had been put in place to govern Indochina, the former Indochina. And
I want to just elaborate on that a bit.
Clear. Yeah, the record is very extensive and clear.
I want to elaborate on that and be more specific. It wasn't simply that Kennedy was moving in that direction. In early October of 1963, Kennedy issued a decision, a National Security Action Memorandum, that put into concrete a decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from Vietnam by the end of 1965. All special assistance units, that included the military and the CIA. And that decision was U.S. policy at the time Kennedy was killed. Johnson, and I've looked into this very carefully, Johnson was not anxious to get into Vietnam, and he managed to stall things. The pressures on him were extremely strong, they were repetitive, and they were unrelenting. And he stalled things even through the Gulf of Tonkin, which is widely, I think, a greatly misunderstood incident, right up until late January of 1965. Basically the incident at Pleiku, and at that point he caved. But this was Kennedy and Johnson were facing from 61 onwards enormous pressures to launch a war in Vietnam, which they managed to put off for 4 solid years. What forced Johnson's hand is another matter, and that's still a murky and difficult story. But it's not the case that Johnson was somehow determined to go into Vietnam and that the policy changed immediately on his initiative when Kennedy was killed.
Although in those first meetings between Johnson and the Kennedy cabinet, it's shocking the amount of advice coming from the Secretary of State and also from the Secretary of Defense that tries to give the impression that the Kennedy direction was toward war and not away from it.
Johnson knew what Kennedy's decisions were. McNamara knew because he had authored those decisions at Kennedy's direction. But as I say,
but the fact that the push was going on, nonetheless, I was just trying to reifirm the idea.
Yeah, the push there was definitely the push was going on, and it was on Johnson, and within days after Kennedy was killed.
Right.
I'm going to look at one more, and we're gonna wrap here, gentlemen. Question about the rise of Black voters, Black elected officials, the rise of political activity among people of color and indigenous people, and how that's impacting where I guess we are and where we may go in the liberal progressive movement.
So the Democratic Party is a party that is a multiracial coalition. The difficulty of the Democratic Party is that it doesn't offer very much to its, in practice, or has not to its low-income constituencies of all races and ethnicities. And this has actually, you can see at least limited instances, and particularly in the south of Texas, where very strong Democratic strongholds, although quite small, drifted to Trump in 2020. Why? Because they were given federal jobs by the building of the border wall and border enforcement. A hard reality, but there it is. And so the lesson I would draw from this is that and I think to some extent it's sunk in with some of what Biden is attempting to do, or the Progressive Caucus is attempting to do on Biden's behalf, which is that you really have to strengthen social insurance. You have to give people jobs, you have to give them security, and you have to give them the means to escape from and stay out of poverty if you want their political loyalties in the long run.
Richard, last words before we sign off.
My last words are that ADA was given an enormous gift to have Ken Galbraith at its helm at crucial moments in its history. And the reason Jamie and I are here tonight is to remind you of his leadership and of the role that ADA has played in the past and is fully capable of playing again. So we're delighted to be here with you all, and we hope you've benefited from the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know
Richard.
we
Thanks very much.
thank you, Richard and Jamie. I put their profiles in, and check out their not only the Galbraith book did, but the excellent work that Dr. Galbraith is doing at the University of Texas, and also other works by Richard Parker. Look for the video soon. Thank you all for a wonderful evening.